Hello, I'm Peggy Daniels Lee at Indiana University's Kelley School of Business in Indianapolis, and this is my final presentation. But before I get started, I'd like to thank Lori and everyone in the class for the excellent feedback and suggestions I've received during the class. Although I've been teaching online for many years, this class and especially your input has made a significant difference in how I teach my class going forward. And I've really learned a lot of things to help make an online class much more interactive and engaging for the students. So I just wanted to thank you before I got started. Okay, so let's talk about the class. As I've said before, it's a grad level operations management class. The students are all working full-time in corporate, government, military, and not-for-profit jobs. They're spread all over the world, and I have two sections this quarter, and the backgrounds are very diverse. I have a physician, actually he's a neurosurgeon. I have people who are deployed in the military. I have folks who work in manufacturing, folks who work in the services sector, and I even have a soccer player who is in Finland. So most of them are working on their MBAs, but some are doing specialized master's degrees. I have one that's doing a degree on business analytics. The primary method of instruction is discussion forums that are discussions of the cases and the simulations, and they use the textbook and the readings to supplement those discussions and to learn the individual topics. This is my class. We recently moved to Canvas from OnCourse, which is a Sakai product, and this is the home page, and it's organized into 6 two-week modules. For the first 4 days, they read the materials and become familiar with the cases. Then the next 8 days, they spend doing simulations and talking in the discussion forums. And then the last 3 days of each module is spent in 2 summary discussions, one in which they select 2 concepts that they learned and discuss them with their peers, and then the second, they describe how the work in that particular module applies to their jobs. So this has been a really good time for me to revise the class for a lot of reasons. One, this is the first time I've taught it in spring. 2, we're moved to a new learning management system. And 3, I needed a course to revise for this class. So it worked out pretty well. But my sense told me that this really was a good time to do it. So the first thing I did was to use the learning outcomes matrix to develop a plan for how to revise the class to meet the standards that were set out in the matrix. And with Lori's help, which I thank her very much for, I developed a plan to revise the class, and I'm a tad behind on it, but it gave me a process and a plan for how to make the class better. And that to me was worth the cost, and everything was to be able to put in writing how I was going to make the class better. So some of the results of that was that I dropped the number of learning outcomes from 9 to 6, and I reduced the number of readings and discussion forums by half. I think this has allowed the students to get a more in-depth discussions than they have in the past. They're less concerned about how many posts they make, and they're more concerned with providing insight. And a lot of that is because I'm using some of the words and the terminologies and the methods that are being used by Lori in our class. So that's been really, really helpful. One of the other things I did was to create an Animoto video introduction and encourage students to do the same thing. So I'll show you what that looks like. I have some discussions here. And the first discussion that they have to participate in is this welcome discussion. And it talks about the class, what it's like. It's a case and simulation based class. And then I asked them to use SoundCloud Cloud Audio or Animoto or narrated PowerPoint slides, whatever medium they want to use to introduce themselves. And I created this little one right here. So it's very much like the one I did for our class. It's a little less than 3 minutes, but I wanted to show you what it looked like. Okay, so that was one of the first things I did to make the class much more interactive and to put a face to me so that people knew that I was a real person. One of the things I have learned from watching other people's final presentations, most notably Linda's, was to give students links. This would be a perfect place to give students links to where the different media can be found. So that'll be an upgrade that I'll make later on. So for the purposes of this class, I used an active learning strategy, and the one that I used was collaborative learning in a discussion forum. So the next discussion that they had was during the first module, and they were charged with discussing the extent to which process variation and demand variation is inherent in the Benihana simulation. They had to do a simulation that's one of the Harvard simulations and then discuss it. They were to get together in their project groups and prepare a short, no more than 3 minutes, either a PowerPoint presentation or a video or something else, and to get their point across in terms of the topic of discussion. And as individuals, they were to provide feedback to at least 2 teams on their work. They had one person selected to post it. The thing that I found was that there were some teams who were very creative. In particular, this one right here, they prepared a YouTube video of their process for discussing the question as well as the answering the question and what further things they would want to look into. So this is what that discussion forum looked like. And as you can see, there were quite a few replies. And it caused a very lively conversation among the students. And we had a really great time discussing it. So I think that part of the good thing about doing things in groups is that it allows them to get acquainted with each other. They can work in groups early on. So this was among the first activities that they did, and it helped them to build a sense of community within the class. So I think that was fairly successful, at least it seemed that way for me. So that was the second thing that I did. The first thing I did, sorry. The media tool that I used was in response to the fact that I normally have a synchronous Adobe Connect session at the beginning of each module, and then another one at the halfway point, and basically every week. I was to be in Spain during the time that I normally do the second session. So I wanted a tool that will allow us to have a conversation virtually. I used Voicethread to have a debriefing of an exercise in which they were to develop performance metrics for an orange juice manufacturing process. And for that, I used Voicethread. I had never used Voicethread before, but I wanted to try it out and see if it would work. And this is what that looks like. Now you can see that in order for me to make it accessible, I had to have the voice, and then I also incorporated the text. And the reason why I did that is because there is a way for Voicethread to be closed captioned, but I couldn't figure out how to create the file that I needed. So that's another thing I'll be working on, is trying to figure out how to create the file that goes along with Voicethread in order for me to make this accessible. Um, the other thing that happened was I got some feedback from Lori about the potential learning curve of doing multiple things. And so I decided not to actually use VoiceThread in the class this time. I also realized that I had been throwing a lot of things at them that they weren't accustomed to. Most of the other classes in the online MBA program do not use cases. They aren't heavily discussions, and so this class is a bit of a culture shock for quite a few of them. And so I decided that the best thing to do would be to come up with another means of being able to discuss things with them. So what I did was, instead, I created another discussion, an open discussion forum, where they could just come in and ask questions. And that's what this is. And so while I was away, came in periodically and answered questions that students had about the particular exercise. It didn't work as well as the VoiceThread probably would have, but I think the students were happy with it. Before I attempt to use VoiceThread with the students, I'll probably prepare, not probably, I will prepare a how to use VoiceThread video. And that way they get instruction on how to do it before they have to use it. So that's my second revision. The third revision was an assignment that we've been doing all along in this class. And that assignment is a two-part quarter-long project in which they have to describe and analyze a process. And what I talked about was the summative one, which was the part two. Part two is the one in which they actually have to analyze and improve the process using some of the things that we've been learning in class, identify the bottleneck and that sort of thing. The element that is revised in this particular one is the rubric itself. And thanks to you guys' feedback, I was able to add something to it that I hadn't included before, which was the percentages that each trait represented. So this is a rubric I use for the I do use for this particular document assignment. I had used another rubric, but this one is much more detailed, and I think it gives the student a better feel for how this project fits with the learning outcomes of the class. So that's that rubric. So the key element for this project was the rubric itself, not necessarily the project. So the project description is part one, and there is a separate rubric for part one. They've already completed that, and I'm giving them feedback on that now. So lessons learned. I learned a lot. There are so many interactive tools that I can use to make the course more meaningful to students and help them to learn and apply the material. I'll be working to make sure that all of my courses are accessible. I think that's very important. We do not have an accessibility policy, which I find to be very interesting, but I think that it will really improve my course significantly if I can make it truly accessible in the ways that are established standards. The other thing I learned is that less is more. The design of the current course we're taking was an inspiration for me in how to revise my course. This course that we're taking is simple, easy for a student to maneuver through, and it meets the learning objectives in innovative and engaging ways. And I think that's what I'm striving for with regards to my class, is to do exactly that. I don't think I've made it, but I do look forward to your comments and suggestions. And so that is the end of my presentation, and I thank you for your time.